States, Senator J.D. Vance. Thank you all. Thank you all. Thank you all so much. Thanks to Ralph for a kind introduction and for having me. You know, Ralph, when you invited me to this a couple of weeks ago, I was thinking to myself, I'd love to come, but I have no idea what I'm going to be doing on Thursday morning. And I'm glad that this thing worked out. And I'm glad that I was still able to come to this breakfast because it's so good to be here among people of faith and so many good friends and supporters and people who've just been very good to me over the years. And I can't possibly shout everybody out. I saw, of course, Secretary Carson. I saw Ron Johnson. I saw the great Bernie Moreno, who will be the next United States Senator from the state of Ohio. But I thought what I'd do this morning is just talk a little bit about how I think about my faith and my own faith journey, just so you understand me a little bit better, and how I think about, hopefully, that we can integrate that into a governing agenda that will work for the American people. President Trump is an incredibly unique figure in American politics. Of course, he's the only person to ever come entirely outside the realm of government or military and run for president and do it successfully. And it's just such an honor to be on the ticket with him. It's such an honor to stand with him after what happened last Saturday. I'm sure that you've heard a lot of people say this, but you will never be able to convince me that that last second turn of a head was anything other than a miracle. I absolutely believe that. I was raised, as I mentioned last night, by my mamaw, who, despite the fact that she loved the F word, was a woman of very deep Christian faith. And, she was in some ways what you might call unchurched. We went to church maybe once or twice a month, sometimes less, sometimes more. But she read the Bible every single day. She prayed every single day. She loved to watch Billy Graham whenever he was on the TV. And that was really my introduction to the Christian faith. And one of the things that I learned, and one of the things I've tried to correct, and I love Mamaw, this is not a criticism, but while I really believed, and I believed quite passionately, there was something a little bit shallow about my faith when I was a kid. And so, like a lot of kids, I went off to the military, to college, to law school, and somewhere along the way, that faith that had developed and was germinating sort of evaporated. And so by the time that I was in law school, I started to call myself an atheist. And there was a certain arrogance to it. I think that there was this idea that I was smart and wise, and I knew things that my grandma never knew. And I think that arrogance motivates a lot, frankly, of secular culture in our country today. But to me, what really brought me back to Christ was finding a wife and falling in love and thinking about what was required of me as a husband and as a father. And the more that I thought about those deeper questions, the more that I thought that there was wisdom in the Christian faith that I had completely discarded and completely ignored, but was most relevant to the questions that were presented in my life as a husband and a father. And so it's funny, my wife, despite not being raised Christian herself, she made this observation to me when our son was about a year old, and I started going to church, and she said, this is not really my thing. I don't have a background in this, but there's something about becoming Christian that is really good for you. There's something about thinking about the Christian faith. There's something about practicing the Christian faith that makes you more patient with our son and makes you a little bit more forgiving when I'm grumpy after a long day. And I realized that is sort of what she was describing, though she didn't have the vocabulary to describe it, is grace. And one of my really strong beliefs is that grace is not this thing that happens instantaneously. That was maybe something that I believed when I was 15 or 16. And I think grace, the way that I understand it, is something that happens over a lifetime. That in ways big and small, if you practice your faith, if you pray, if you think about what it requires of you, then God makes you a little bit better each and every single day. And that, to me, has been the greatest lesson and the greatest blessing of my faith. Now, I was baptized actually for the first time, I think in 2018 or 2019. So I sort of really came back, and I came back in a big way. And I love being part of a faith community. I love, taking my kids to church every Sunday, and I love just the questions that they ask. And I've got a 7-year-old son, and man, does he ask some really brilliant and some really weird questions about faith. I'm sure all of you have had this experience raising a kid in the Christian faith where you're like, man, where do these kids come up with this stuff? And that's certainly been my experience in raising my kids. And Ralph and others, if you have any good advice for how to answer those questions, I'd appreciate it, because it turns out my 7-year-old's already smarter than I am. That's his mother's influence, I think. And I appreciate what you said, Ralph, about my wife. I mean, she really is just an amazing person, and she gave a really, really great speech. And I And, it was such a tough act to follow, in part because I was crying backstage, and in part because she's beautiful and has this just incredible relatability to her. And I'm like, who in their right mind thought it was a good idea for me to follow this person and give the biggest speech of my life? And I realized it was my idea. So, my own fault. Let me leave you with just a couple of other thoughts. There has been a lot of rumbling in the past few weeks that the Republican Party of now and the Republican Party of the future is not going to be a place that's welcoming to social conservatives. And really, from the bottom of my heart, I want to say that is not true. Social conservatives have a seat at this table, and they always will, so long as I have any influence in this party. And President Trump, I know, agrees. But when I talk about his uniqueness in politics, I think one of the great virtues of his approach to politics that his critics will slander in every which way, but President Trump is uniquely capable and aware of politics being the art of the possible. What can we accomplish in the here and now? How do we advance the ball 1 yard before we advance it 10 yards before we advance it to a touchdown? And so I'd ask my social conservative friends, as you see the administration unfold, as you see the campaign unfold, remember that this is a guy who delivered for social conservatives more than any president in my 39 years of life. I think he deserves a little bit of grace, and he deserves a little bit of trust, and I hope that we will all provide that to him. I certainly know that as his running mate, I will. So I'm gonna get out of here, but I want to leave you with one more final thought, and it comes from one of my favorite theologians, the character Jules in the movie Pulp Fiction. And if you've ever seen this movie, sorry, this will make sense in a second. If you've ever seen this movie, there's a scene where Jules is sort of a violent gangster. And a guy unloads on him at point-blank range, and he sort of looks at himself and expects it to be, riddled with bullets, and then he's totally fine. And he gets into an argument with his fellow violent gangster about whether this was a miracle, whether God had come down from heaven and stopped these mother effing bullets. That was the exact phrase from that movie. And they argue about it, and they go back and forth, and the guy says, and Jules, this is Samuel L. Jackson's character, says, well, look, it's not about whether God changed Coke to Pepsi or found my car keys. What matters is that I felt the touch of God. And I want to tell you a story because I think that, and again, I was motivated in part by having conversations with my 7-year-old. When we think about miracles, we think about Moses parting the Red Sea. But one of the really deep beliefs I have is that there are all of these small little miracles. And if you look for them, you actually see them. And I'll tell you, yesterday morning, I woke up, I went to bed around 1 in the morning, and I woke up around 3:30 in the morning. And, my mind is racing. I'm the kind of guy, I sleep like a baby. Even the past couple of weeks going through this vetting process for the vice presidential nomination, I still slept like a baby. My head hits the pillow, I'm out, I wake up 6 hours later, and I feel great. That's how it's always been for me. But for some reason yesterday, on the morning of the biggest speech of my life, I've got 2.5 hours of sleep. My kids aren't going to be up for 3 or 4 hours, so I'm bored, alone, anxious, and thoughts are racing through my head a mile a minute. And I say very simply, after 30 minutes of trying to, count sheep or count backwards from 500 to 1, I finally just say, Jesus, please help me. And I'm not kidding, that was the last thing that I remembered until 3 hours later. And again, it's a minor thing, and I'm sure that people who don't believe in God will say, oh, that's just a weird coincidence, a minor little thing, but I felt the touch of God. And I think that if we look out there and we look in this country, we look at our past and we hopefully envision a future, we remember that there's a lot